So welcome everyone. This session is about formative assessment in a bilingual context, critical thinking and active learning strategies by Guilherme Guerra Meira. And let me give you some information about Guilherme. Sorry guys, my computer is really slow today, but it's the things are working. Just a second. It's going. I'm really sorry. It's really slow. I'm getting Guilherme's bio. All right, Guilherme Meira is an EAL teacher and pedagogical coordinator. He holds a CPE and a specialization in bilingual education. He's currently pursuing a master's degree in applied linguistics at UFRGS. And he's mainly interested in teaching language assessment needs and how best they can be developed to improve teaching and learning. So Guilherme, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Is that okay? Yeah. And can you see my screen that I have just shared?
Yes, we can see the presentation.
You can see the presentation. Okay, great. So first of all, thank you for attending this talk. And thank you, Brasilia chapter, for having me. So my name is Guilherme. Bear with me. I'm nervous. I think we all have butterfly in our stomachs in conferences like this. So let me introduce myself. I am an English teacher based in Porto Alegre, Rio Grande do Sul, and I teach in a regular school in elementary and high school levels, where I'm also the bilingual program pedagogical coordinator, and I'm graduating language from Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul. And I'm currently pursuing a master's degree in applied linguistics. So the reason I designed the session is to share some ideas and concepts and tasks that I've been developing in the school that I work. So this is our plan for today. By the end of the session, we'll have discussed the role of teachers today, strategies for promoting active learning, the importance of critical pedagogy, and I will have some project sharing moment and the assessment criteria for this project. So I'd like to start with this quote from Freire: "Education must begin with the solution of the teacher-student contradiction by reconciling the pose of the contradiction so that both are simultaneously teachers and students." Aligned with that, as I am a pedagogical coordinator in one of our sessions with the teachers in the school that I work, I asked them what is the role of teachers today in classroom, and some of the answers you can see here in this cloud: facilitator, mediator. So the role of the teacher is to engage, is to guide students. This is aligned with the 21st century learning skills, or the 4Cs, where probably you heard like that. The 4Cs: critical thinking, communication, collaboration, creativity. But when we think about life and career skills, we're talking about flexibility, leadership, initiative. And when we're talking about media and technology, we are talking about multiple literacies, different text genres that now students have access to. This is also aligned with the 10 general competencies from BNCC. And when we talk about active learning methodology, I like to remember a study made from SIGAV, where he asked students to complete the painting in a right way. And most of the kids, they were like first graders, they assumed that there was a right answer. So most of the drawings were houses. But when he gave the same task for the students without saying it to complete it the right way, just saying complete the painting, we had multiple different answers. Students used their imagination. And what I think we can learn from that is, if a student does not feel comfortable to make mistakes or to take chances, we are not preparing the student for the future. So in classroom, we have to deliver students tasks that are hands-on, that are meaningful, that give students agency, and that fosters autonomy. So this is the cone of learning. And Dale says that after 2 weeks, we tend to remember 10% of what we read, but 90% of what we say and do. So it must be active, it must be hands-on. And according to Bloom's taxonomy, in the base of the pyramid, we have remember, so defining, duplicating, listing, and memorizing facts. But at the top of the pyramid, we have creating, producing new and original work, designing, constructing, and developing, giving the opportunity for students to be authors of their own learning. So it shifts the focus from the teacher to the student, and the delivery of the content is no longer a sole responsibility of the teacher, right? Because students need to think critically in order to complete tasks. They need to engage personally in the work, and they have to maintain accountability of their own participation because they take responsibility for their own learning. And for all of that to happen, they need to be aware of the assessment criteria. We are talking about that later on. So the student is in the center of the educational process, and it fosters autonomy because the teacher is a mediator, because students use language as a social practice, giving them deeper understanding and appropriation, and of course, personalizing the learning experience. When we talk about critical pedagogy, which is connected to what I've been talking so far about active learning, the emphasis is on human beings, their needs, their contexts, and their histories. In a nutshell, in critical pedagogy, we want our students to become aware of and to question societal status quo, right? To encourage students to question and challenge inequalities that exist in society, but also in their families and in schools. So obviously, implementing critical pedagogy will look different in different subjects, and what works in one class may not work in another. Not only because of the group of students, but also what is being taught. So for example, a history teacher may challenge an event that is traditionally seen as progressive, while an English teacher, when teaching literature, may question a common cultural stereotype found in a book. And this is exactly what we've done in this project, and I'll be sharing. So some important aspects. Questioning and problem-solving contexts that demand students to remember and apply and expand on their previous knowledge. And students must receive feedback after the tasks. So the assessment criteria must be clear to the students, but also to the teacher, of course, because it's the base. So that's what we are talking about today, a task that I've developed with my students, and it's an oral task. So in private schools, oral tasks, they tend to be repetitive, and sometimes they are often a pretext for reviewing grammar topics or checking for correct pronunciation. So additional language teachers, they need, after an oral assessment, they need to assign grades, and sometimes they don't have a clear criteria to do so. So the lack of an assessment rubric can lead to a difficult assessment process because teachers use different criteria when they are assessing. The student doesn't really have a clear feedback after the task. And if the students don't have a clear feedback, there is no possibility of learning from mistakes and from mistakes made in the task. So it's precisely why a clear feedback is so important. So I do believe that any student, independently of their own proficiency level, are able to produce language and be part of any social context but within their own level of proficiency. So an A1 student from CFR, an A1 student will be able to order coffee in a coffee shop just differently, in a different way, in a simpler way than a C2 student. So for us to be on the same page from the get-go, I want to share some theoretical background so we understand the task that I developed and the assessment criteria. So when I talk about additional language, I come from the understanding from Schlatter and Garces that language is taught in the curricular context. They are part of the resources needed for citizenship, and they are useful for society. And also from the understanding of Simons, that the use of language is for action in the world. Schlatter and Garces also say that when it is necessary to use different genres, speech genres in the classroom, so that students have the opportunity to engage in different social practices through the use of language, but language that are relevant to them. And according to Batista, the importance of using new technologies in the teaching and learning of foreign languages, and because even more today actually, because of remote and blended learning that is so necessary right now. So some assessment literacy. When we talk about formative assessment. Okay. Are you still listening to me? It's okay. All right. So let's.
Yes, Guilherme, we are.
Okay. Thank you. So as for the concept of formative assessment, as I was saying from Brown, it's every activity, every task proposed by the teacher and carried out by the students, which can provide information to be used as feedback for the students' practices and also for the teacher's planning. And Omaggio defines a performance assessment as something that a task that will measure the acquisition of a specific content that it was worked in the classroom during a certain period of time. So performance assessment will never require content that has not been previously worked on in the classroom. And Brown explains that the washback effect are the consequences and effects of an assessment in the teaching and in the learning process. So washback effect on basic education can be very positive if the assessment, if the task is prepared by the teacher and it's connected, it's convergent to what will be asked for the students in tests and entrance exams such as NA. But that does not mean that the assessment must be in the same format of those tests, just that it needs to ask students for the same competences and abilities that these exams ask. So let's talk a little bit about the context where I was working and the students that I had in the test that was developed. So it was the first term of an 8th grade group, and we were reading in languages non-fiction literary texts, such as biographies and autobiographies. These were the genres required as readings, not only in English, but also in the Portuguese classes. But in English classes, they read Becoming Jane Austen by John Spence. And they had the opportunity to study the structure and the characteristics of a biography and adaptations. We talked about the movie Becoming Jane Austen as well. So they had a moment to learn about this type of genre. If we want students to produce different genres, they must learn and be aware that these genres exist and read them first so they can reproduce it later. So, but at the same time, in the material we used, in the books we used in English classes, we were, in terms of grammar, talking about different ways to expressing the future in additional language. And then everything had to be adapted we had the COVID-19 pandemic, we went to emergency remote teaching. Most of classes were online until the end of the year of 2020 and part of 2021 as well. So students had to study from home. And in the start of it, we were recording video lessons. But after that, after a couple of months, we were teaching remotely with synchronous and asynchronous classes as well. So we had to adapt. And then I had I had a spark of an idea after I was reading Pedagogy of the Oppressed from Freire, where I had this quote: "Looking at the past must only be a means of understanding more clearly what and who you are, so you can more wisely build the future." So we were talking about biographies and autobiographies, and our book, in terms of grammar, talked about future. When I found this quote, it clicked, and then the project really started. So discussing the difference between biographies and autobiographies, and after reading Becoming Jane Austen, where we challenged the status quo and the role of women in society at that time, the project moved into a new stage as we started working with the idea of how we would like our lives to be in a post-pandemic future. We are already in 2022, and I think we're still thinking about that. So what would be our plans and dreams for the future? And then we discussed different structures for the future, will and going to. And I asked students to create their own future autobiographies. So we started with a pre-task where we remembered what we have been studying so far, and then students had to remember the structure of a biography and autobiography, what we have learned so far about the future, and then the task itself. It was an oral task where students had to record an audio. We call it like an audio book, but an autobiography audio book. But they will be talking about their future, not their past. I think someone has his or her mic on. Okay. So the goal here was to provide opportunity for students to use and understand the language as a social practice. And this was the main goal. So we had recorded classes about that, also synchronous classes. And finally, they posted their autobiographies in audio, but also the cover of their ebook. So with the art teacher, they had to create their own ebook cover. So this was a moment where they could truly be themselves, and they could write their own story, their own moment to shine. So they posted their covers on the Padlet platform. And what is nice about this platform is that it allows posts, but also likes and comments without having to create an account. So it allows them to share the task and to promote interaction among the entire school community. They didn't have to create an account for that. And having the moment to create their ebook cover was something that they really were invested in, because I really believe that when we talk about language, using graphic elements to connect nonverbal and verbal text gives them a lot of agency, and they feel more comfortable to produce in the additional language, especially those students that don't feel so comfortable speaking in English. So we started from the premise that a cover is not a book, and students were free to express themselves artistically and assemble their audiobook, not only the audio, but also the cover, to represent their possible futures. So the title of the project was A Cover is Not a Book, which in Portuguese would be something like Pela capa não dá para ver, ou não julgue o livro pela capa. And students began the teaching unit as subject readers. They were reading and discussing Jane Austen and English literature and the status quo of the time and women role at that time, the period of time. But they ended up as subject authors, producing their own future stories. And what I think is most important, spreading hope in times of pandemic. And finally, by sending the audio to classmates and to me, the teacher, of course, they were positioning themselves as subjects in a real situation of language use. So what about the assessment? The assessment was a performance assessment because the task was authentic. It was related to real life. It was student-centered. And we use a rubric to do that. And all the recordings of them were on an online portfolio. And when we use rubrics and portfolio, we are of course having assessment for learning because we have a classroom-based component. It's a formative assessment, but we can go further because when we as teachers and students understand assessment as learning, not just for learning, because by creating assessment rubrics with clear criteria and goals, we give students agency so that they place themselves as part of the process, understanding and even building the goals with the teacher. So we have an increasingly plural learning. So let's talk about the rubric itself. So the decision to reproduce, in addition to the criteria, the descriptors of the abilities according to BNCC, it was just a reflection of what we need, that we needed the assessment criteria to be previously presented to the students. If we want students to produce an oral task and this will be assessed, they must understand what teachers are expecting of them. And the decision to keep the rubric, descriptors in Portuguese language was made thinking about students of different levels of proficiency, because the feedback that student will receive from the table, from this assessment grid, is an important learning moment. And depending on the student's proficiency level, it may become more limited by being in the additional language. So the structure of the table was given with these 5 criteria: genre adequacy, grammatical adequacy, vocabulary adequacy, fluency, and pronunciation. And it was divided in 3 different levels: proficient, average, and in development. The descriptors, they were divided into concepts that aim to give a complete feedback to the student and not reduce the assessment time as an assigned grade. So the student received the table with the descriptor that best indicated their resourcefulness in the oral task in each of the 5 criteria. And the score was at the end of the table, because the student needs to understand his or her grade, but the visual organization prioritizes and values a description of skills and the descriptors itself, not the grade. So if a student had to redeliver, redo the task, and if we as teachers, we requested that from the students, they will know exactly in which criteria they had to improve in the oral production. So returning to Bakhtin's concept of discourse genres, the position of each speaker is unique and each utterance is unique, because it is necessary for the teacher to be very clear within the planning of the task which oral genre was being assessed. In here, we had a moment to talk about biographies and autobiographies. We talked about audiobooks and the oral genre, and we learned about talking about plans and goals for the future. So we connected both to reproduce this genre that was completely aligned with what we were living at the time, like almost like having our lives on hold because of the pandemic. So it is up to the teacher to use this assessment tool, this rubric, to measure whether the student is able to include repertoire in vocabulary and in grammar structures that are appropriate for the context of production. So it is connected to the genre, and also that is relative to what the students were learning in the classroom. It would not be coherent to penalize students for not using structures that were not taught. And in here we also have, so we talked about genre, grammar, and vocabulary adequacy. When we talk about fluency, I understand fluency from the concept of Brown, that it's fluency as a fluid and natural language when using the additional language, and not having correct pronunciation or not committing grammatical inadequacies. These will happen. And about pronunciation, the choice to keep pronunciation here in this rubric was because we understand pronunciation as adequate pronunciation. That does not mean not having a Brazilian accent, and adequate pronunciation is the one that the interlocutor understands. So my final considerations. The importance of working with oral genres and clear assessment criteria that are shared with students is evident. And when we are assessing students, we must always take into account the need to work authentic situations of language use and use oral genres that exist in different social contexts. And if there is no possibility of learning from the mistakes made in the task, there is no reason to assess or to grade such tasks, because it can't be considered formative. And this goes back to what we were talking about critical pedagogy, because when I asked students to do this task, I wasn't expecting them to link their future stories necessarily to what we have read in Becoming Jane Austen, but most of them did, and most of the girls did it, especially talking about the agency and in today's society, the possibility that they have to, and the rights that they have today, but that women didn't have at that time. It was very, very, very nice to see how it all connected in the end of this task. So these are my references. I can send the PowerPoint and the table grid, the rubric, and these references by email if you want. In here you have my contact, my email, my Instagram, and my LinkedIn. And I am open to questions. We have some time for that. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Guilherme. That was very, very good. Does anybody have any questions? You can open the mics now, and you don't have to write the questions in the chat box. Guilherme, I have a question. Which site can you share the link to the site that you used to create the books and the audiobooks?
My mic was off, sorry. Yes, I can do that. Let me just find it and I'll put it here in the chat box.
Thank you.
Let me just stop sharing my screen. Okay, there you go.
Anybody else have any questions?
I don't have a question. I just have a comment. I really liked the rubrics you presented because they were in Portuguese. And sometimes like a pet peeve I have sometimes with the use of rubrics is that I find it can be, I think the idea behind using rubrics is really nice. So you can really show students exactly what they are required to do and all of that. But I find that the wording is sometimes targeted at teachers, not students. And it's usually in English, which makes it, I think, more difficult for students to understand exactly what it is that is expected of them. And I was really pleased to see with the rubrics you showed us, because they were in Portuguese, and I thought it was really awesome. Because sometimes I think we are afraid of using L1 in the language education process, as if that would somehow keep students from learning or whatever. But when it comes to assessment, I think this makes perfect sense, because you're actually making sure that students really understand what is expected of them. So I really, really like that.
Perfect. I totally agree with you. Thank you, Marcus. And Tatiana just put it on the chat box, translanguaging. That's it, right? I guess that is the point. I have worked in English courses where we were asked as teachers to speak solely in English. And I'm not going to say that it didn't work, because it did, but it came with a little bit of suffering from the students, right? It is hard. And having the moment to go back to their target, to go back for the original language and the target language, and having the connections made makes everything easier for them to understand what they are being asked, especially when you're talking about regular basic education. They need to know what we as teachers expect of them.
It's also interesting, the fact of being Portuguese, because it's a formative assessment in the end, right? So they really, really, like Marcos mentioned, you really understand, the students really understand what they have to improve, and like you said, what's expected of them. So it's interesting that it's in Portuguese.
Yeah, because sometimes I notice that I think like people who design rubrics for teachers to use, and that's normally like a director of studies, a coordinator, or a superior, usually not the teacher, a teacher, him or herself. And sometimes it seems to me as if the rubrics are designed with the teacher in mind. The type of language used sometimes is the kind of language that only teachers can really understand, I feel. And the fact that you're using Portuguese, this makes perfect sense to me. And even like for language, like private language programs, not just regular schools, I think it would be sensible to adopt rubrics that actually make use of the first language, just to ensure that students really know what is being expected of them, and that the language is simple enough for students to understand. So because I think that, like I said, I think that the goal of using rubrics is commendable, but the way it's implemented, sometimes I find it questionable,
Especially because they're, sorry.
Go ahead, Joyce, sorry.
No, I was just going to complement what Marcus said, especially because the rubrics, they are connected to BNCC, which is a Brazilian document. So
exactly,
it should be in Portuguese, right?
And this fear that we have as teachers of using Portuguese especially in documents like a rubric or something like that. I guess it's so related for us to us like having this idea that we must only speak in English because we want students to produce in the target language. Sometimes it's so difficult to get them to do it. So why are we doing it? And then we do not think about how it is important to have assessment as something formative and not only a grade feedback, right? I think I have, and this is also related to class planning because I guess Joyce, let me see. Yeah, Joyce wrote here in the chat box like Schlatter is wonderful. Schlatter works at Urgs where I have studied, and I was part of a research group where she participated, and I taught Portuguese an additional language by her coordination. And I think that I've learned so much about being an English teacher by being a Portuguese as an additional language teacher, because I mean, Portuguese is our language. And then when I had to stop to think about, okay, but why am I teaching these grammars point? What is the point here? I think it made much more sense when I'm preparing my lesson plans in English to really have goals that are related to social context, to social action in the world, and not grammar topics, because grammar books in Portuguese sometimes have stuff that my students from additional language that they were here at Urgs from other countries, their goal was not to learn how to like different verb tenses because they would have to reproduce that in a test, in a formal test. It was because they need to communicate in the world after the class. After the class, they had to go to the supermarket and buy stuff. So that made a huge impact in my teaching formation.
All right, guys, any other questions, any other comments? There is a comment from Joyce at the chat box. She was also one of the consultants for BNCC.
Right. I'm not sure, but I do believe so.
Okay, so guys, there are some announcements. This is a free event, but we are accepting donations to support a cause. So here I'm putting in the chat box the link for the donations, and also the program that we have, today's program and tomorrow's program. Still, if you want a certificate for attendance, here is the link. Let me see. Right. And Inez posted on a chat box that, yes, she was, as a fact. So she was one of the people on the BNCC. Yeah. Guilherme, thank you for putting your email here. Yes.
Yeah, sure. I just put it here because if anyone would like to have the PowerPoint slides, the assessment rubric, and the link to the audios of my students, I'll be more than happy to share it with you.